All right, well, let's jump into the book of Joshua. And so now we have finished the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. And so we ended on Deuteronomy, and now we're moving in after Moses and into the time of Joshua. And so this is going to begin what's often called the historical books, is kind of a name we throw it. It's 12 books from Joshua to Esther. Elsewhere, you might have heard these books titled the former prophets. Some of these would be classified as the writings. That's really how they're labeled in the Hebrew Bible, but for most of us, we're gonna recognize these as the historical books. So that's what we're going to be getting to kind of move forward to for the next several weeks. And to kind of give you an idea of what these historical books really kind of focus in on, you can really break it down, and I just kind of jotted down some ideas that there is the focus on Israel's entry into the promised land of Canaan under Joshua's leadership, and so that's what we're going to really look at today. Israel's life in the land under the time of the judges, and then ultimately their transition to the kingship, and so that's where we really get into, time of 1st, 2nd Samuel, and then 1st, 2nd Kings. That transition to kingship and Israel's existence underneath an earthly king and no longer just under Yahweh. And then you have eventually that moves towards the dividing of the nation of God's people into pretty much rival nations. So you have Judah in the south and Israel in the north, and then how those people, God's people, live in each of those kingdoms. And then ultimately the decline and exile of each kingdom, eventually their rebellion and their sin eventually gets them defeated, overthrown, whatever you want to call that, where they're pushed into exile from the land that God has promised them. And then ultimately this period of the historical books really looks at life in that exile, and then eventually you get to God delivering his people and their return from exile, where they come back into the land. That's kind of a quick summary of what the historical books will kind of overview. And so we'll kind of flesh that out as we move forward through the book of Joshua all the way into the book of Esther. We'll be looking at those and kind of those themes and that narrative as we kind of really look at how all this is building towards the promised Messiah and that longing, that groaning for God to deliver his people ultimately and come and reign with them. Okay, so the book of Joshua, if you remember, we picked up, we ended Deuteronomy, so now we move towards Joshua. So it picks up at the death of Moses, and so timeline, we're somewhere around 1400 BC. And one of the neat things about the story of Joshua, it in a very real way fulfills the Abrahamic covenant. So if you'll remember back in Genesis, when God called Abraham out, he said that he would... the promise that he gave to Abraham, that covenant, that he would multiply and bless his descendants, right? That they would be more numerous than the stars in the sky, sand on the beach, whatever you want to kind of phrase it, this idea of limitless, infinite, that it would just continue to be an abundant blessing, and not just for his people, but they would be a blessing to all the other nations. So that's part of the Abrahamic covenant, that God would multiply and bless Abraham's descendants. He would make them into a great nation, and then he would give them a land of their own to be God's covenant people, that they would live there, they would coexist, and then God would reign over them, and they would be one big giant family, but also one kingdom with God as their ruler. And they are now, as we ended in Deuteronomy, they are now outside of the promised land, right? What God had said that he would give to them. They're sitting outside looking in, awaiting to take over, to conquer, and to be given the land that God has promised them. And so one of the things I want you to think about is, as we're kind of tracing this through, yes, God has promised this to the people. He's made a covenant with Abraham. He will see it through because God is true to his word. And we're going to see in Joshua there's an element where this is very much fulfilled in the time of Joshua, and this second generation of Israelite slaves, right? The first generation, they died out. They were punished for their rebellion, and so they didn't get to inherit the promised land. So now we're in the second generation that Joshua is taking up, and we're going to see how they respond to what God has called them to in their obedience and their faithfulness to that calling, and how that plays itself out. And so there's going to be very much a real fulfillment of that Abrahamic promise in the book of Joshua. But be thinking, though, this is very much true in the Old Testament. Everything is pushing forward to a greater fulfillment. So there's characters, there's themes, there's narratives where there might be a partial fulfillment, or even in a very real way, a tangible, physical fulfillment of that promise. but there's going to be a much deeper fulfillment in Christ whenever he comes. So that same idea there, that there's going to be a great family that God would bless through Abraham, they're going to receive a promised land, all these different things that find their fulfillment as we study the book of Joshua. There's going to be a greater fulfillment in the time of Jesus when we have God reigning. He promises his spirit. He promises a place where his actual kingdom would come to earth, and that's what we await. We have the promise of heaven, but we know that ultimately God's going to renew with the new heavens and the new earth, and so we can look forward to that promise. And so there's much to be kind of grappled with there about how we find that fulfilled in the book of Joshua, but then ultimately we look toward the time of Jesus. Few things about the book of Joshua. It can be easily divided into two sections, and so conquest and settlement is a kind of an easy way to think about it. Their preparation, their ultimate conquest of that promised land, that God drives out their enemies, and then their dividing up of the land and their settlement of it, and then kind of their covenant renewal that Joshua gives to the people, that they would be faithful from this point forward. And so you can kind of, those conquests and settlement, like I just mentioned, includes preparation for conquest, the taking of the land, the dividing up the land, and then finally living in the land. And then so we're going to trace from Joshua's taking up the mantle from where Moses left off, and then eventually the book of Joshua is going to end with his death. And so I want to read a quick quote real fast. I think this kind of sums up a little bit of the storyline of the book of Joshua. It says, "The book of Joshua is a literary production designed to create and support the identity of the people it calls all Israel. They are the people of Yahweh." Remember, that's the personal name of the Lord that God gave to Moses whenever he called him. That's the very personal name of the Lord. So they are the people of Yahweh, the divine warrior. They are the rightful masters of the land of Canaan. That's the promised land. They are a people formed by the demands of the law given through Moses. The book of Joshua seeks to give its readers, that's us, the courage to meet whatever current challenges are brought on by their identity, our identity, as Yahweh's people. It also seeks to communicate hope for a future fulfillment of Yahweh's promises. We kind of talked about that with the coming of Christ and what we have hope for towards the future, but also even right now. Various literary and rhetorical strategies are used to achieve these purposes: celebrations of the divine warrior's victories, narratives about obedience, disobedience, and land grants, verbal maps of claimed territories, sermons urging compliance with the law of the Lord. The book of Joshua is a witness to the power of a shared story to generate, define, and defend a community. And so that applies very much to us. This story is very much a part of us story in Jesus. And so there's lots we can learn here and take from some of the themes, some of the characters, and some of the stories that we're going to find. Some of the major themes in the book of Joshua, I would say God's faithfulness, that no matter what, God has made a promise and he will see it through. So the land he promised to Abraham, he's going to make sure that he delivers on his side. Even amidst the people's sin, God is going to still always be faithful. And so we can find hope in that. Another thing would be God's sovereignty. And this kind of plays itself out in Joshua. There's some hard passages which talks about God essentially allowing the Israelites to exterminate entire people groups as they rid out the land to prepare for settlement. And so we read these and we think, how can God allow that? But there's very much a real idea of holy war here, where that is God the creator, that's his land. There's the holiness of God, where there cannot be a place, if God's going to settle that land with his people, then there cannot be sin and rebellion and wickedness. And these nations that currently exist there, they are absolutely a sign of that. And so it's almost like a sacrifice given to the promise, to God's holiness, and in the way that they're going to go in and they're going to inherit that land. So God's sovereignty is at play there. And then lastly, our response, so our obedience and faith. We're going to see this in Joshua. We're going to see this in the second generation. How are they going to respond knowing what happened to Moses, not to be able to see the promised land for his rebellion and striking the rock when God told him not to? The first generation of slaves, when they come through and they rebel and they don't get to see the promised land. So how will the second generation respond? Will they heed the words of those who have gone before and do things differently, or will they fall short too? And so just a word of caution to us is, like, we can learn from our predecessors. We can learn from this story. We can learn from other believers who have gone before us. positives and negatives, things that they did well that we can continue to extend, but also areas where they struggled, and we can use those as kind of warning signs to make sure we don't stumble in those same ways. So our obedience and faith is another important thing. And so I would kind of sum up this way that Joshua calls us to trust God and not follow our own fears or resort to half-hearted or expedient behavior. God will always be faithful and will accomplish his promises, but we have to be faithful in all he has called us to, right? So we are called to be sanctified, and part of that is trusting in God and being obedient to what he's called us to, no matter the circumstances. And so we're going to find out in Joshua, like, they're coming up to a land where they're trying to go and conquer it, and so they're surrounded by enemies, battles that they don't feel like they can win, and God's saying, just trust me. This is my land. You can trust my word. I will deliver you. I will provide for you. You just have to be faithful and do what I've called you to do. And so we can definitely learn from that as well. Some of the key characters that I would just kind of point out as you work through this book is obviously Joshua, how he takes up for Moses and he really leads and is a picture of this competent and godly leader. So very much a type of Christ that we can look forward to. You've got Achan is an example of, to even in good times, that we always have to be faithful. Don't get greedy. If God has blessed you with a season of health, if God has blessed you in a time of prosperity, even in those good times that we have, don't get greedy. And so Achan actually kind of steals and he disobeys the ban that God has placed on Ai as they're going to the battle of Ai, and so he takes plunder from Jericho, and essentially God has to punish the entire people for it, and Achan actually, him and his family are actually killed for it. And so even in times of success and good times, we're going to call it that, just use the example of Achan to know that there's no excuse. We always have to be aware of our sin nature and always be ready to fight it, because consequences are at play if not. So you've got Eleazar, who's Aaron's son, who's going to be a pretty important figure in this book as the high priest. You've got, of course, Rahab. Many of us are probably familiar with her story, how she hides the spies. We'll kind of get into that briefly. And then Phinehas, Eleazar's son, is another important character. And then here's some just kind of a quick rundown of some of the stories and some of the narratives that we're going to find. So, we include, like I said, Rahab hiding the two spies when Joshua sends them out to go kind of scope out the land. She knows of the name of Yahweh and the victories that he has delivered into the hands of his people. And so she actually hides the spies to make sure they're protected. Israel's going to cross the Jordan on dry land using the Ark of the Covenant. Pretty powerful image there of God miraculously letting them cross the Jordan. The marching around the walls of Jericho, they don't even have to battle. They just be obedient to what the Lord has called, and they see the walls crash down of this enemy that God is going to rid out from that promised land. Talked about the loss of the initial battle at Ai because of Achan's sin, and so God punishes, but then he also delivers whenever they take care of the problem with Achan, and then they go back and are faithful just through a military ruse. They're able to overthrow Ai on that second attempt. And then you also kind of move towards the end of the book, all these pictures of the land being conquered and land being dispersed amongst God's people. So very much a real fulfillment of the promise. I mean, it's like Christmas morning for all these different people groups, because they're visibly inheriting land where before they've been wandering. Their ancestors, their parents and grandparents were slaves in Egypt, wandering in the wilderness, and now they actually have a place to settle and to call home. And all of it has been given to them by the Lord, who protects and is faithful to his promises. And then finally, the book kind of ends with Joshua's final summons to Israel to renew his covenants, to renew their covenant with the Lord, to be faithful in all things. And so those are kind of a quick rundown. I do want to kind of give a few quick verses to kind of bookend, and then I'll leave it up to you to kind of dive into some of these stories. But if you look in Joshua chapter 1, this is a really cool picture about the story of Joshua. So verse 7 says, "Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it, for then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So this is the commissioning of Joshua, and hopefully you hear that, and it's the same words that are speaking to our hearts, to be confident and courageous for the Lord. Even knowing we don't necessarily know what's out in front of us. There's going to be hard times. There's going to be time of prosperity, times of despair. But God will always be faithful. He's just called us to be confident in him and be faithful, to be diligent readers and obeyers of his word. And God's law is crucial to that. And he's told us what's right from wrong. He's told us how to obey. So we need to be faithful to Jesus in those things. And God will always provide. And so that's kind of the calling of Joshua. Then you look at the very end of the book, over in chapter 24. This is kind of the end of his life. And I think this is what's kind of cool is you really do see the same kind of theme about God's word and the importance of always choosing the Lord above all else, and everything else will fall into place. So here we are in chapter 24. Let's pick up in verse 14. It says, "Now therefore fear the Lord," this is Joshua talking, "and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers serve in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorite in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And again, verse 19, you can see Joshua speaking to his people. "You are not able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions of your sins." And so you can kind of see this idea of what is at stake here, like our very lives, to choose whether we're going to be faithful to God and be a part of his covenant community and be a blessing to those around us and to the nations, or to continue to choose the gods of those the worldly gods, our idols, to choose ourselves and kind of see that as a direct contradiction to the holiness of God and his righteousness, and because of that we'd be punished and would be outcast from experience life in his covenant community and life in his promised land. And so Joshua is very much a fulfillment of that through his ministry, through this book. And as you dive in and kind of see some of these stories, you'll see Joshua's faithfulness. He wasn't perfect, but he definitely tried to always lead and put the Lord first, and so definitely a model for us to pursue as well. And so Joshua's book ends with his death, and then we move very much forward into the time of Judges.